Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. It's a strange show taking dives into, the weird world of music, of course, right? So, in today's episode, we're actually returning to a label we've looked at before, the cassette label Self-Help Tapes. A very strange label, with a handful of releases under their belt. So when we introduced the label to the channel, we discussed 3 pieces by Steffey Stanley Tinker Watkins, an unusual release comprising of live experimental recordings and one singular composition just sort of sandwiched between them all. So today we return to the label, we'll look at one of the most fascinating excursions the label has released, I feel, in terms of identity, which will make sense when we get into this one. What we have here is an electroacoustic album composed of pipe organs and moogs, acting as an examination of the self, a journey into finding identity through the composition of experimental music. So today I present Identity Opposition by Untitled. So, hard to start this one off normally, I would say, as there's no artist being credited to this particular release, right? At least none on the Bandcamp page. Very bizarre. So, I guess we'll just start at the beginning then, right? So, I've wanted to return to the world of self-help tapes for a while now. When I purchased the album 3 pieces, I also chose to get this one as well with the intention of eventually reviewing it. Another enigmatic little presentation of audio art that really piqued my curiosity when I first discovered it. So when it came to purchasing this, the Bandcamp credits the release to Untitled. No artist behind the release, eh? Very unusual. However, Discogs and the physical copy here tells us a little bit more about who's attached to this particular release. Interesting. However, I think it makes sense, especially when we review this album under the lens of being uncredited. For all intents and purposes, this album is credited to Untitled. All we have this time is the album name of Identity Opposition and the track listing. That does open up some of the details, as well as a very brief Bandcamp description that goes as follows. A recording of a woman's journey of self-discovery as she confronts the obstacles that prevent her from reaching her full potential. Instrumentation, pipe organ and moog instruments. So, an artistic expression of what it means to be someone, and a journey of discovering who that is, who they are, through rather abstract instrumental performances. I think it's very neat, and I remember being very curious about the fact that it was credited to an untitled artist. Now, a bit of digging did tell me who made this, or who I think made this, but considering how the album has been presented to us, on the Bandcamp page, I think we will leave that for a bit later, and for now we'll just accept the mystery for a little bit longer, right? So what we have is an experimental droning composition sourced from both pipe organs and moog, very much like the album Luft by Sandra Boss, an album we discovered in a previous episode of Weird Music, right? Anyway, what can we expect from this is perhaps some strange droning compositions that examine identity through a representation of 2 doing forces, in this case the acoustic pipe organ and the electronic moog, right? And it all results in something that's oddly inaccessible, but I just think it's truly fascinating, so let's dive into each of its tracks then. So, starting off with Identity intro, starts off incredibly quietly. Almost no sound to begin with, complete erasure in a form of literal nothingness that occurs for an uncomfortably long time. That is until you get the faint rise of a drone occurring from that darkness, rising and rising, just suddenly existing in the space that starts to overload, displaying an abstraction of notes caught in a deluge of effects, climbing in and over this in this fascinating fashion before it all just ends on nothing. It's such a brief yet brilliant opener that just bulldozes its way through, stunning you with its electric rays before navigating to the next track, Birth. So this one feels very cosmic and spacey. The drones from the instruments just colliding and collapsing in amongst each other, as we're giving such a strange abstract imagery of just formlessness, it feels. And within all of those chewy drones, though, it all just starts to oscillate wonderfully, becoming this interplay between these rising drones and then these more esoteric notes as well. And I think, it's kind of delightful in a weird way, right? Especially with that immense low end in the background just resonating with such a delightful rumble. Like, I just adore low ends when it comes to drone albums, and I really adore how it sounds here. And I think all of these different elements all coming together with just how stretchy and dense the whole thing sounds, it becomes a right twister of a listening experience, something that just seems to pull on your very being in very strange ways before it all just fades right back into the silence once more. So we then get a very long silence before crashing into the next track of Identity Opposition, the title track it seems. So this one feels like an uncomfortable randomization of notes and tones, just rattling in the ear with these odd effects as drones attempt to put it all together into a more coherent image, only for the chaotic occurrence to just drag the entire thing along into this spectacular display of just chaos, it feels. It's like suddenly just gone from your sight before you've even been able to take in the details. It's just like there and then it's gone again. And it's such a weirdly uncomfortable, chaotic and monstrous form that seems to represent this contrasting elements of identity and then the opposition in the forms of these literally battling opposing forces in music. Like, I don't know how truly intentional it is, but just how the music itself is coming across to me. But listening to it and knowing that you've got the Moog and you've got the pipe organ, it just feels like one represents the identity, one represents the opposition. And hearing them battle against each other in this track just results in something that is rather brief, but very cool. So our next track is the longest track on the album, Pausing Existence. So this one kind of rises in on a bed of ambience, just elongated airy drones filling up the space with this warm soft blanket of noise. And after the chaotic elements of the previous track, this one feels like a welcome moment of respite, just a gentle bed of drones that lets you sink into the floor entirely, becoming more and more submersed the more it all just pours on top of itself. And it does become a little bit more intense the more it all occurs, of course, suddenly introducing different layers of drones that add this sense of uncertainty, of perhaps suddenly no longer enjoying that brief pause in time, as though the intensity of becoming stuck in a place has suddenly dawned on us. And we can feel a little bit of that panic rising, perhaps. Maybe, anyway. But despite the more cautious tone, I do find this one to be delightful to hear. It feels so oddly psychedelic, I find, oddly immersive, as it just pulls you into this abstract world of peculiar frequencies. And for me, I kind of just get this representation of just pausing time itself when you just kind of blank out for a moment and just fall out of existence for just, length of time it feels. Interesting concept to examine on the very album, and with the names, you kind of do get a narrative that I think is being explored across these instrumental tracks. The story of the central theme of identifying the untitled artist's own sense of existence, and the opposing force that come into the shape of these overwhelming existentialism, perhaps. And here, I kind of feel like a kind of examining of those moments where it feels like you don't even exist at all, represented in the form of very dense abstract music. I just think it's bizarre, but wonderful, and those who know my love of music, have seen a lot of these videos, just know how much I adore existentialism, when people are examining that, and the idea of examining it in the form of abstract instrumental music, I just think it's really cool for some reason, and I think definitely one of my favourites off of this album as well. So, our next track is Safe Harbour Interlude. So, a stuttering of lowercase. It's just a brief flash of soft occurrences that flash by really quickly again. Quite literally an interlude that ends the first half of this cassette. A moment of respite to find ourselves, especially after the existentialism of the previous tracks, before you then flip over to the reverse side of the cassette, where we then get Keyholes, second longest track here. So this one just immediately bombards you with a very cosmic occurrence of resonating looped notes that slowly fades back into the silence once more, letting a nothingness occur for a few brief moments until we then find ourselves aboard the spaceship as unusual tones and frequencies all start to occur out of nowhere. And this one feels very computerized, very digital, perhaps as though forcing an algorithm to assemble an understanding of yourself. But it then too fades into the silence as we get a rise of anxious, cautious notes once more, suggesting to us that this track becomes, more of an interplay of drones, quick stutters of glitch electronics occurring against each other, split up by brief passages of silence, perhaps, With so much of the album exploring this sense of opposing forces, I think it's another one that becomes that wonderful expression of those central themes and the character of the album once again. Kind of as though those musical elements that have made up identity opposition on the first half of the album have now been split up into two literal separate occurrences here, examined in such a weird and unusual way, and using silence to emphasize the strangeness of their existence, whether it be the identity or the opposition. Very weird track. And I'm honestly a little bit stumped by this one, because it feels very uncomfortable and strange, just a deluge of drones piling atop another once more, for it then sort of fades away to let an assortment of glitches occur. But I do adore that wonderful interplay between those two forces that is dominating so much of this album in so many different contexts, it feels. Though here, it just really seems to fry your brain as it all occurs. Moving along, we get the next track of Selfhood, the penultimate track. So this one kind of rides up with this weird carnival effect, a kind of glorious vision of lights and colours, some frequencies rising in the background as you get this delightful assortment of notes twirling around and around. And I think after everything we've had, there's something kind of lovely about this one. You can really hear the pipe organ at work here, all played on these upper registers in this colliding randomization of notes as the Moog just loops and winds over these slowly oscillating frequencies that just zap into your ear. For me, after everything we've had, this feels like a moment of self-actualization for our untitled artist, represented to us as the very instruments themselves making sounds that, actually tell them apart from each other, if that makes sense. I don't know how intentional it is, but it feels intentional, and it's interesting as well how Moogs and Pipe Organs both create these very droning forces, but throughout the album, it's hard to really discern them both apart until we get to here where it feels a bit more evident. Maybe, anyway. But I think it's very cool, the idea of using the instruments more like paintbrushes of sound to create these stories that put us along these unusual narratives, despite existing as pure sound and nothing more, right? It's perhaps always the way with abstract art as well. Based on what information we have, and what we feel and think from what we've heard, we kind of have to come up with our own inferences of what we think is going on. And to me, it's just what is coming across on this album when I hear it. You know, this weird interplay of opposing forces and stuff. Like, I don't know how much of it is true. It's probably all wrong, just a very poor interpretation. But it is what I think when I'm listening to it. And I think it's neat how it all comes across like that to me whenever I hear it. So we then get our final song, Interlude, a final stretch to the finish. So more silence once again, much like the opening track, just once again having that sense of nothingness occur. A fade back into the formlessness after having finally identified ourselves, as we now return to nothingness. And from it, once again, rises as that airy drone, one that vibrates with a sense of the wind rising and rising, threatening to crash against you. A sense of us still being there in these very changing forms, continuing the story, but perhaps now in a different context, perhaps when it all next occurs. The identity being something that is shifting and amorphous as the music itself. So, essentially with that, we've finished covering Identity Opposition. A hard album for me to summarise, but I will try my best. I think what we have here, as I have mentioned, an existential examination of the self, turning the lens on the Untitled artist who uses their sound palette to evolve this understanding into something tangible. And it becomes just the opposing force between the Moog and the pipe organ, as mentioned, both fighting against each other in these opposing forces that then attempt the process of erasure, perhaps, you know? And across the various compositions, we kind of get the sense of examining these different states of mind that we feel when we're isolated, alone, and like we just don't exist. But even at the centre of all of that, there is a version of us that is existing, that is there and has always been there. And even with all that uncertainty and anxiety that infects this examination of ourselves, we can still see something of ourselves if we just look hard enough. And as for our Untitled character, recording of that existence comes in the form of this musical expression. Very weird, right? Of course, it is all just inference and interpretation, but I just really get a sense of that narrative that comes through, these instrumental performances, essentially. A sense of this artist trying to just figure themselves out, essentially, and then representing that to us in the form of this abstract music. Even when all the odds seem stacked against them, it feels, I just think it's truly fascinating. So perhaps this is why they have credited themselves as Untitled on this release then, right? Now, without further digging, listening to this particular album, with the context that we've currently been provided, it still pushes us no closer to knowing who is really behind this album. And I think that's a really cool concept to explore on a musical release, to literally make an album that examines its identity and the opposing forces to that, and then remove the identity from that release. It's very weird, but I think it's a very neat little thing. Now, even erasing the identity on the digital release, only to just reveal it on the physical copy. Now, I think that's something interesting as well, because it kind of helps with that dual sense of opposing forces, identity and non-identity. Difference between a digital and a physical release, right? Perhaps telling us that on the internet, it's impossible to really have an identity sometimes. It becomes blurred by the anonymity that the internet provides, which is exactly what our nameless artist has lent towards when it comes to digital presentation of this record. Like we know from self-help tapes, just bare-bone minimalism, lack of information, just music and track names and nothing more. And I don't know how intentional it is, as mentioned of course, but I think it's really cool if that's what they're doing. So who actually is behind all this then? Well, this is at the point in the video where you need to, make a decision if you want to, watch the rest of the video to find out who is behind this, or if you'd rather accept the mystery. So, spoilers. On the physical release and on Discogs, this particular album is attributed to one, Tara Srikrishnan. Not sure how it's said, sorry. An individual who's got 2 album credits on their Discogs and nothing more. The aforementioned Identity Opposition, which we've of course discussed today. And a split release, Sri Krishnan and Tinker, the Heroic Quartet split. So, not much else to go on there, is it? Now, however, in regard to that second release, we have come across the Tinker on that album before, the very same Tinker that appeared on the previous video covering self-help tapes, when we looked at 3 pieces by Steffey Stanley Tinker and Watkins. So this tells us a musician that runs in the very same circle as another very strange album release that we've looked at. But it's still not much to go on. But a little bit of further digging did unearth a little brief mention of a live performance by Sri Krishnan at Mills College. No doubt the very same college where the opening track of 3 pieces was performed. So are they a peer, a classmate, a student? Essentially, somebody from this strange little scene, perhaps suggesting this underground artistic movement at or around Mills College that resulted in a bunch of these releases that ended up on self-help tapes. Or maybe just the 2 we've looked at. I think it's very neat that these unknown people are creating these fascinating little artistic expressions. And I'll be honest, I actually don't know if Sri Krishnan wants to be associated with this release, which is maybe why it's credited as an Untitled on the Bandcamp, which is why I'm actually wary of bringing it up here, but such is the stories that come from weird music. These are the little fragments that all come together when we do a little bit of research, and although we've not seen much, although maybe we won't see much more from Sri Krishnan in future, I have a feeling they've actually moved into politics, so if that's the case, good luck with that. But regardless, I think it's neat that this was made, that this was created, and this expressed such an unusual sense of vulnerability of existentialism, of wanting to understand the self through an abstract exploration of musical process. It's all resulted in this very limited physical release in the form of this cassette. Very odd, but it amazes and it fascinates me. And I'm glad to have dived into this one as, that very examination of self, of womanhood, of opposing battling forces, all being, strangled together into this audio art experience. Truly amazing. Truly wonderful. And so I think with that, we will come to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. Once again, so glad to have finally found the time to write about one of the most enigmatic and rewarding little releases hidden away in the very recesses of the internet. Perhaps a little digging revealed some probable truths, perhaps? I don't know the full extent of it for sure, but I feel like the main experience of this album comes from the interpretation of the very material itself, of how it has all been presented to us in such a strange way that eschews traditions of authorship in favour of a larger mystery. I think it's amazing, and something that is so far off the norm of what you'd expect. So yeah, very glad to have gotten around to discussing this one. I am hoping to continue to delve into self-help tapes in the future. The music the label offers is such a weird collection of experimental dirges that have happened to be catalogued in very limited runs. I have checked out some others, especially as I was sent a whole bunch of them by the label when I purchased the 2 we've now looked at. So it might be fun to dive into in a future video, but we will have to see if we get around to it. In any case, I do hope you've enjoyed watching this episode of Weird Music. Any suggestions for unknown record labels that few people have unearthed? Let us know in the comments. If you want to check out this one, there is a link to the Bandcamp below, as well as to self-help tapes as well. With that, I wish you all the best. Hope you take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.